The Final Voyage, a story from the Titanic. Prologue. My name is Samuel Hayes, and I was 22 years old when I boarded the RMS Titanic on April 10, 1912. For many, the Titanic was a marvel of engineering, a modern-day miracle touted as unsinkable. But for me, it was something much simpler: hope. For as long as I could remember, I had worked hard. Growing up near the docks in Southampton, my days were filled with the smell of salt water, the distant creak of ships swaying in the harbor, and the sound of men shouting orders to load or unload cargo. My father was one of those men until an accident crushed his leg and kept him bedridden. That left me, the eldest of 5 siblings, to take his place. Dreams of a better life, of far-off lands across the Atlantic, often seemed just that: dreams. Life on the docks was routine but relentless. Morning after morning, I watched ships set sail, carrying passengers to places I could only imagine. Sometimes, I would pause during work to gaze longingly at the vessels, imagining myself on board, free from the chains of responsibility. The day I learned I had secured passage aboard the Titanic felt surreal. It was a stroke of luck, a favor from an old friend of my father's who had worked as a ticket clerk. It wasn't first class or even second class, but I didn't care. I was leaving England for America, where opportunities waited like ripe fruit on a low-hanging branch. I was among the third-class passengers. The third-class cabins, located in the lower levels of the ship, were basic but far better than what I had expected. As I walked down the narrow corridors, the air was filled with a mix of curiosity and camaraderie. Other passengers' families, groups of young men, and lone travelers like me nodded politely as I passed, their faces reflecting the same hope I carried within me. The ship felt alive, humming with excitement, while the upper-class passengers mingled on their exclusive promenades. Drinking champagne and dining on delicacies, we in steerage made do with simple but hearty meals and lively conversations. For many of us, it didn't matter, just being on the Titanic was enough. Chapter 1: Departure. The docks of Southampton were alive with energy that morning. Everywhere I looked, there were signs of life: children running barefoot, vendors hawking their wares, and families embracing tightly their goodbyes, lingering as if they might never see each other again. It felt as though the entire city had gathered to witness the Titanic's maiden voyage. The ship itself was staggering. Standing at the edge of the dock, staring up at its towering hull, I felt both dwarfed and awestruck. The Titanic was unlike anything I had ever seen. Its sheer size seemed to defy logic. The polished black and white exterior gleamed in the morning light, and the towering smokestacks looked as though they pierced the clouds. I stood in line, clutching my small suitcase. The suitcase was old, its leather cracked and worn, a hand-me-down from my grandfather. Inside, I carried my life, what little of it I could bring. A loaf of bread wrapped in a cloth, a bottle of water, and the photograph of my family my mother had pressed into my hand the night before. Her voice still echoed in my mind: "Remember, no matter where you go, you're still one of us." As I ascended the gangplank, I hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the crowd. The sight of so many faces, some tearful, others jubilant, made my heart ache. This was my home, the only home I had ever known, and I didn't know if I'd ever see it again. But when I stepped aboard, a strange sensation washed over me, part exhilaration, part trepidation. For the first time in my life, I felt untethered. Chapter 2. Life Below Deck. The third-class quarters were bustling with activity. I shared my cabin with 3 other men, each as different from the next as the countries we hailed from. Liam O'Connell was Irish, his thick accent carrying a warmth that immediately put me at ease. He was older than the rest of us, with graying hair and a stocky build that spoke of years of labor. He told us about his wife and 3 children back in Galway, his eyes lighting up with pride whenever he mentioned their names. Jakob Lindström, a carpenter from Sweden, was quieter. His English was halting but sufficient, and he spent much of his time sketching designs for furniture in a small notebook. Marco, the youngest among us, was an Italian teenager no older than 17. He spoke little English, but his smile and enthusiasm bridged the language barrier. Our room was small, with 2 sets of bunks stacked against the walls. The wooden walls creaked faintly with the ship's movements, and the air smelled faintly of fresh paint and salt water. It wasn't luxury, but it felt like a haven compared to the cramped, damp lodgings I'd known in Southampton. Dinner and socializing. The third-class dining hall was a revelation. Long communal tables stretched the length of the room, and the smell of freshly baked bread and steaming soup filled the air. It was lively, a tapestry of voices in different languages blending into a symphony of humanity. Liam regaled us with tales of his adventures in the Irish countryside, his stories punctuated by hearty laughs. Marco entertained the children at the next table with sleight-of-hand tricks, producing coins and small trinkets seemingly out of thin air. At one point, Jakob leaned over and said softly, "We may not have the fine china or crystal glasses, but we have this. That is enough, yes?" I nodded, feeling a sense of camaraderie that I hadn't expected. We were all strangers, but in this moment, we were united by the same dream, a better life in a land of endless possibilities. Moments of wonder. The Titanic was a world unto itself. By the 3rd day, I had explored every corner of the areas accessible to third-class passengers. The third-class open deck quickly became my favorite place. It was a modest space, crowded at times, but it offered an unobstructed view of the endless blue horizon. Standing there, with the ocean stretching out before me, I felt a sense of freedom I had never known. Chapter 3. Exploring the Titanic. Every corner of the Titanic held an air of wonder, even the areas accessible to third-class passengers. I would walk the narrow corridors, marveling at the ship's design. It was clear that the architects had spared no detail, even in the lower levels. The walls were paneled in polished wood, and the electric lights cast a warm glow that felt both modern and comforting. But my real sense of awe came from the moments when I managed to steal glimpses of the more opulent parts of the ship. One afternoon, as I wandered the ship, curiosity led me toward the grand staircase. Even from the shadows, it was breathtaking. The golden railings gleamed, and the chandelier above sparkled like a crown of diamonds. A carved wooden clock adorned the landing, its face frozen in elegance. I wasn't supposed to be there, of course. A steward caught me lingering and politely but firmly guided me back to the areas meant for third-class passengers. Yet even in that brief moment, I felt as though I had been transported to another world, a world of glittering gowns and velvet dreams. A meeting that changed everything. It was later that same evening when I saw her. I had wandered too far again, drawn by the cool evening air to the railing of one of the upper decks. I wasn't supposed to be there, but something about the quiet made it feel as though the rules didn't apply. That's when I noticed her standing alone, her back to me, staring out at the darkening horizon. Her pale blue dress caught the fading light, shimmering like water, and her hair, pinned up in soft curls, framed her delicate profile. She must have heard me approach because she turned her head slightly, meeting my gaze. Her eyes were a soft hazel, warm and curious. I froze, unsure of what to do or say. I was a third-class passenger in the wrong place, and she was clearly someone who belonged here, someone from a world far removed from mine. But then she smiled. It wasn't a condescending smile, nor one of amusement, but a genuine, open expression that made me feel as though I belonged in that moment. "Good evening," she said softly, her voice like music. I managed a nod, my throat suddenly dry. "Evening," I replied, my accent rough and unpolished in comparison to her refined tone. She didn't seem to mind. "It's beautiful, isn't it? The ocean at this hour." I glanced past her at the horizon, where the sky bled into the sea in shades of deep blue and silver. "Aye, it is," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We stood in silence for a moment longer before I excused myself, mumbling something about needing to get back. I walked away quickly, my heart pounding. I didn't even know her name, but I would never forget her. Chapter 4, The Iceberg. April 14, 1912, began like every other day aboard the Titanic. The sea was calm, the air brisk, and the ship sailed steadily westward. The mood among the passengers was light-hearted. Liam, Jakob, and Marco were in particularly good spirits that day. Liam had managed to procure a bottle of whiskey from one of the stewards. And we spent part of the afternoon sharing stories of our pasts and hopes for the future. That night, after dinner, I decided to take one last walk along the deck. The air was colder than usual, biting at my skin, and the stars above seemed impossibly bright. The ocean was eerily calm, the kind of stillness that felt unnatural. I didn't think much of the sudden jolt that came around 11:40 p.m. It wasn't violent, just enough to make me pause and glance around. Others must have felt it too because murmurs spread quickly through the corridors. Some dismissed it as nothing more than the ship shifting course, while others, myself included, felt a creeping unease. The warning and rising panic. It wasn't long before crew members began knocking on cabin doors, instructing passengers to put on their life jackets. The sight of the bulky, cork-filled vests was enough to turn the unease into full-fledged fear. When I reached the upper decks, the scene was one of controlled chaos. Crew members tried to maintain order, ushering women and children toward the lifeboats. But as the minutes ticked by, the reality of the situation became undeniable. There weren't enough boats for everyone. The realization hit us in third class even harder. The gates that separated us from the upper decks remained locked, and desperation took hold. Fathers pleaded with stewards to let their families through, while others tried to force the gates open. The air was filled with shouts, cries, and the distant sound of the Titanic's orchestra playing an upbeat tune, as if music could mask the growing panic. When the gates were finally opened, it was too late for many of us. Most of the lifeboats had already been launched. I watched helplessly as the last few were lowered into the water, their small forms bobbing against the vast Black Sea. Chapter 6: The Final Hours. The Titanic tilted more with each passing minute, the bow sinking deeper into the freezing Atlantic. The once brilliant lights of the ship began to flicker, casting eerie shadows across the deck. People clung to anything they could: railings, lifeboat davits, even each other. I stayed near the stern, where a group of us had gathered, hoping against hope that we might survive. The orchestra played on, their music now somber and haunting. "Nearer, my God, to Thee." It was a hymn I had heard in church as a boy, and its familiar melody brought tears to my eyes. When the ship finally broke apart, the sound was deafening, a cacophony of grinding metal, shattering glass, and screams that seemed to echo into the heavens. I was thrown into the icy water, the cold so intense it felt as though my chest had been pierced by 1,000 knives. Chapter 7: Rescue and Loss. The hours that followed were a blur of pain and numbness. I clung to a piece of floating debris, my fingers stiff and frozen. Around me, the cries of other passengers grew weaker until there was nothing but the sound of the ocean, and the faint hum of the Carpathia's engines in the distance. When the rescue ship finally arrived, I was pulled aboard by strong hands, my body barely responsive. I looked around, searching for familiar faces, but they were nowhere to be found. Liam, Marco, and countless others were gone, swallowed by the sea. Jakob, miraculously, had survived. He found me later, and we sat in silence, too broken to speak. Epilogue. In the years that followed, I built a life in America, as I had dreamed. I married a kind woman, raised children, and worked as a dock worker in New York. But no matter how much time passed, the Titanic remained with me. Late at night, when the house was quiet and the world outside slept, I would sit by the window and stare at the stars. Sometimes, I imagined I could still hear the music, the cries, and the unyielding roar of the sea. The Titanic had been the start of my new life, but it had also marked the end of so many others. It was a paradox I carried with me, always a reminder of both the fragility and resilience of the human spirit.